Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Atomic Podcast. I'm extremely excited to really be talking to Nicholas um, uh, Rosseinsky. Sorry, and but Nicholas is really a very special as a person, but also as a scientist that sits in the intersection between consciousness, physics, computational systems. Um, I would say, complexity theory, and really has some deep, really concerns about how we think about science as helping us in different existential moments that seem to be colliding for us. And it's not just about communication. We're going to talk about it today, but it is about really understanding the role of science, the role of consciousness, the role of spirituality, and how they actually complement each other, how we build upon them. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Nicholas, and please carry on. Give us a little background on you.
Thank you so much, Rodney. Yeah, I'm really excited for our conversation today as well. Thank you so much for inviting me and to this platform so we can share our conversations with other people. That's such a great idea. Yeah, so I come into the present moment kind of from as a child, a fascination with mathematics, and then which led me to theoretical physics, and then into string theory, where I was super disappointed that these beautiful, complicated equations didn't really tell me about why I chose, Wheaties over cornflakes in the morning. Um, so I then took like the mathematical quantitative into more of a social sciences kind of setting in management consultancy and then investment banking, where there was all these complicated mathematical models of decision making, and in investment banking, the story in financial markets is super dense data sets that we could get some insight from. And long story somewhat short, I was running a portfolio, a very big and complicated portfolio through the East Asian financial crisis of the late 90s, and felt completely let down by the modern economic theory that I'd learned at that point. So that brought me to a pause in terms of, well, I've gone all the way through this physics and economics built on Homo economicus is basically a classical physics dude, right? And it doesn't work. So I was gonna do a PhD in economics to try and find out what that was all about, but took a left turn that I'm so grateful for into computational neuroscience at that point to try and get into the brain and understanding it again from the mathematical computational viewpoint. Which then brought me to another kind of falling off point when I started to think about consciousness, because that seems to me there's some really big unaddressed sort of paradoxical questions there that's actually might one day be a beautiful portal for science to launch itself into and transform. And then alongside the computational neuroscience investigation, there was definitely, I had become a father. I was worried about the world that I was either leaving to my children or even what I could say to them about it. And that took me on a spiritual journey. And so just to wrap that up relatively briefly, right now, one of my central loci, a place you'll find me, is the Center for Dialogue in Science, which kind of has this premise that we need to have that dialogue word is very central, like not just a talking, but a meaningful, connected, deep conversation about what these different realms of science, spirituality, and maybe a humanistic or sort of ordinary everyday person kind of perspective would bring. Because we are, I think many people accept this, approaching some existential moments, maybe a conjunction of existential moments. And maybe it's a sort of confirmation bias of the path that I've taken, right? But I do think that we will be really well served by a flowering of science into its next most beautiful version. I think you and I have said this isn't about going backwards. It's not a scientific Ludditism. It's not. It's actually taking it forward into an even more beautiful and powerful version that can answer actually not just some of humankind's existential questions, but some of science's own unresolved issues, right? I think we'll get wrapped into this. Yeah.
And so thinking about science's unresolved issues, of course, there's many issues that are unresolved. But I was wondering, in your in your organization, what are some of the issues that do come up that remain challenges for so cross understanding as you're describing it? Are they from an educational standpoint, or someone that's socialized in certain ways? Is it language? Is it I'm sure it's all the above, but I wanted to know, like, from your real sort of flesh and blood experience, what are you seeing as some of the benefits, but also some of the barriers
Yes.
in
So I
this,
think
dialogue, if I could just put a period on it?
right. So I think one of the big things that I come across is something that I've lived myself and was very much an aha moment, and I'm hearing more and more about it from other scientists, is the fact that I could get all the way through um, advanced postgraduate study at two world leading institutions, right? Without ever having to, and one of them was American. I can sort of believe this of the UK, but I couldn't believe it of the US, without ever really having to take a philosophy of epistemology course. Like you can get so narrowly specialized onto this sort of train tracks that modern science is currently running on, it's the blinders are so. I mean, I was shocked. I was like about myself to realize I thought I'd been like doing all this super open-minded inquiry, and I was like, holy schmoly! Like I have it completely wrong. I mean, the primary and I think perhaps most immediately accessible example of this is, I mean, this blue and black thing isn't really the matter coffee cup. It's a brain-mediated representation, right? So when I was a physicist, I thought I was studying this, but I'm not. I'm studying the thing that's sort of prior to this, and then the photons and the brain, and then some image making, right? When I woke up, I was like, I don't know, how old was I when that must have been like in my late 30s, right? And how far I'd gone thinking I was studying with. So that kind of it's just it's partly educational, it's partly language because we don't have language for the different things, right? Representation of cup, and can we just say cup, right? And that's very natural heuristic for every day, but it's completely in, and we get so cooked in these things. And then, I mean, consciousness is one of the central topics that we use at the center to try to explore this, simply because, I mean, for many reasons, but one is it's so laden with these kind of crosstalks and misunderstandings. Also because I think it's very poorly addressed by the current scientific um, edifice. And then I think another example, like the way that spiritual folk, if I may, apologizing to them, use that categorization, they even use the word consciousness and the way that scientists would use it. So there's like at least three different versions in science, and there's at least three different versions in the spiritual community, and then none of them are the same. And so those are just two examples of how the educational track and the language within science kind of can put the blinders on, and then kind of across science and spirituality in the same domain of consciousness, again, language and just contextually located discourse. This group are very used to using the words one way, and this group are very used to using it another way. But I do also think that there might be something deeper in the human condition that's dividing these groups, and more like what is the factor of division in humankind that plays out in this kind of division but then runs into society? Is it the same factor of division that's dividing the societal fabric of the US right now politically, for example? So the inquiry at the center is, scientists, quote unquote, versus spiritual folks on the topic of consciousness and these issues. And so some of those things about language and contextual education and so on. But then the goal really is to go more deeply and meet each other in, like, is there something deeply dividing us, right? But we got to get through all this other stuff first. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just share a little quick story. In a previous discussion I had with Brandon Bro, he runs the nanotech, nano science division of the U.S. government, and he was saying that when he was in training, going through material science and learning to be a scientist, he was very fascinated, and and then he took a class on Shakespeare, and and suddenly his advisor was saying, like, you can't do that. No, no, you need to focus over here. You have so much you have to put towards this over here, which is kind of core sciences. That is like extraneous. He goes, no, this is actually feeding. And so he stood his ground, but he never forgot that moment where the walls were going up already around him. And so just anyway, it plays into what you were describing a bit.
Well, I think that's a beautiful example, and Shakespeare in particular is a beautiful example because all the world's a stage, and all the men and women on it merely players is saying this is not the cup itself; it's an appearance on the stage, right? So
Right.
Shakespeare was like well tuned into this, but I think that's something that we mentioned before. It's really like okay, so like we want to keep like the depth of knowledge that comes from this like precise focus, like onto nanomaterials, right? But how do we also support not only like a breadth around that so that we don't become this blinkered guy, right? That I was and still am in many ways, right? I mean, right? Keep that, broaden it out, and then even, and this is in the administration and funding of science, have people have like two deep foci and, a connective context that's artistic, poetic, creative as much as it is scientific. And then what will come from that? I mean, I mean, you know, if I had my want with how science was arranged going forwards, we'd be producing far more of those kinds of people.
Yeah. And what I think is happening, particularly young scientists, entrepreneurs, they find themselves thrown into a world in which they're no longer socialized in the ways in which you describe, but they have to be very quick learners to be that cross thinking, that sort of, that kind of pollinized way of connecting the sciences, and also uh, pattern recognition of what kind of results can be achieved both across chemistry, across physics, in so many different ways. And it's not just purely from the hard, so-called hard sciences, but it's also, the benefits of philosophy and sociology to really understand what we're doing, the whys, not the
Right,
hows, but the why of, oh, why are we even making that? You know,
right,
and so I think because of perhaps, and I'm just throwing an idea out, because of planetary existential problems, climate change, alignment, superalignment, AI, and these areas in which we see a very near horizon of very troubling results. I think people are scrambling. I say coming out of school to get up to speed in a way that school didn't teach them. So they can actually be part of these larger teams and, in fact, maybe drive them. That's my hope. My hope is that the difficulty of the challenges is remaking the scientist today. I hope I'm right. Um,
well,
it's
I mean, it definitely resonates or conspires with my own bigger picture view of this thing called the meta crisis or the poly crisis, the collection of all of these big things as a crucible for humankind. So I definitely hold that at the sort of species level, that it can be that. And yeah, you're tuning into something sort of at the more individual level that having that happen for scientists, young scientists, would be an example of a very sort of more concrete example of how that might be taking place.
I
I
want
think,
to ask you, Nicholas, a question.
yeah.
So, when you moved into cognitive neurosciences, and you were exploring, um, what are some of the ideas, or say meta theories, that resonated with you? Because also you dovetailed into consciousness studies, as you mentioned, that have paradoxes kind of inherent. And I'm not even talking about dualisms.
Well, so I think the first thing to say about my entry into so it's actually via neurobiology first. So I did the biological basis stuff. I sort of synthesized myself an undergraduate degree in neurobiology, and then up into neurosciences that way. I think I something that I did experience, I think it's important to recognize when we're talking about the structure of science is the way in which I experience biologists and also cognitive scientists to take physics as fixed and finished, effectively. So this is the finished platform on which, we explain biological systems relative to. And that then um, actually, I think, becomes very problematic when we get up to consciousness. In terms of meta theories or larger organizing schemas, again, when I was making that transition, I was opening up a spiritual dimension in myself. So I think the main thing that I was actually experiencing was massive confusion about the materialist paradigm that was sort of hidden in, and it was also I had not touched it through that lack of philosophical explanation, and then it was also like sort of hidden in the walls of the neurobiology department, as well as definitely in the walls of the physics department. And so I think the primary thing I was experiencing at that period in my life was confusion about how to organize that. Maybe you had something else in mind in
No,
that
no, no,
question,
no.
or
I think no, you're
no,
touching on it. I wanted
yeah.
to maybe ask you if you could maybe describe some of the contours when you say materialist paradigm. What what did you come to understand that paradigm to be?
Well, it's so interesting because that in itself is it's a very nebulous and like even teasing out, like you could ask what's wrong with materialism, right? I mean, nothing is wrong with it per se, but we have to understand what it is. So philosophers have it as this substance materialism thing, which I mean, I mean, I think in science nobody thinks about substances, right? So then what is materialism? That's a very philosophical concept, like a mind stuff and a matter stuff, and philosophers are always going on about it, and I think scientists are kind of looking at each other and like checking their phone. But so what does scientific materialism mean in science? It means that the underlying set of explanatory entities are of a particular kind and behave in a particular way. Namely, we've got a current fundamental physics theory that's of a kind, and then sure, we understand that it's not fixed, but it's going to evolve within an envelope, right? And so I take materialism to be the view that everything can and will be explained by some future evolution within this envelope. And even, I mean, I think that was a real aha moment for me when I boiled it down that way, because that isn't in any text. I mean, maybe it is in a textbook somewhere, but I didn't find it there. So I think, like, again, in terms of what do we want to share with young scientists as they emerge to try and from the academy to try and engage with these problems is these sorts of framings of the ways that you can come at, so they can be really clear. You can keep, or and then there is a question: what is wrong with that? Well, there is something wrong with that in terms of what it can and can't explain. But then we can, we've got all the precise scientific knowledge is parked in here. And when we expand it, can we do it in a way that's precise and still keeps all that scientific knowledge, right? And let's get really precise about it and clear. Yeah.
Yeah, so to me, it sounds like the epiphany is a similar epiphany that you had, or you probably have had many, um, where you finally have a sense that there's a huge part of the world that doesn't render itself to explainability, and I say the universe. There's a huge part of our relationship to the cosmos, and that's all the way down to the smallest particle and all the way back up. That is inexplicable. It doesn't mean we can't find the language, but to say that we have the epistemologies to sort of pull that together properly
Right.
into a materialist frame is kind of where the big aha comes, that you're actually living in a very small world materially
Right.
from a perspective standpoint. Um,
Yeah.
and then suddenly you step out of that and you go, oh my God, look at the richness, you know? Uh, I didn't know. It's kind of like, I just didn't know,
Yeah.
And I think it's that sense that materialism does run the world, more or less.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm probably overplaying it, but then suddenly when you look at, you know, uh, near-death experiences and so many other experiences I don't have to go into in which the materialist framework or kind of causality ends up being in question, then suddenly you go, well, hold on a second. There are other ways of seeing um, the world in which we as humans, but also other entities live and thrive. And that to me is a super exciting moment. What you do with it, like you said, confusion, you had confusion, right? What you do with it really is the big challenge, right?
Right, right. And I think again, if I'm harping too much on this theme of the young scientists, let me know and I'll move on. But I mean, I certainly received the sense, and others do too, that we have to be on an express train to intellectual clarity, right? And to encourage people to be, it's okay to be A, confused, and B, to be with that, sit with that confusion, right? particularly if I have a clear sense of purpose that I want to go this way, and that what materialism, for example, isn't serving me, sit to the courage to be with that confusion and let it open into something. Because then I think this is where this greater that is not explicable that you're pointing to can actually start to make itself sort of present in like, well, maybe this is an idea, or here's an image, right? And that's the artistic side, or a way to connect science with the artistic, is to let that sort of intuition, inspiration from the greater inexplicable come in and inform my science, and to keep, I think I receive this from some people, that would somehow dilute the science. No, that's what's going to help science move forward into its greatness, right?
I agree. And you mentioned this word clarity. Um,
Yeah.
I would add discovery, because it's where it's that sort of nexus between um, the inexplicable, the explained, um, and I'll say the unknown. Where I know we're talking super high level, but the idea is that that you sit with that because you know discovery's around the corner. Now it might be 10 years down, or but you know that this is not negative. This is not non-productive. You are actually
Right.
being useful. This idea
Right.
of scientists being a kind of utility. You, you know, William James or any other great sort of thinker across different kinds of disciplines. They knew that they had to sit with and live with problems that were completely unexplained, and that's where they sort of cultivated. So I don't want to go further with this, but I do think that the new scientists, we're not just talking about those folks coming out of school, we're talking about ourselves as well.
Yes.
that
Yes.
that young, call it the young scientist or the new scientist, in ourselves as much as we
Right.
are about mentoring others.
Yes. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Definitely. And I just want to, I don't know if you want to move on in a moment, but I just want to throw out one thing. You mentioned about how lots of different experiences aren't explainable or admittable within the scientific materialist framework, right? And one really important one is this kind of like intuitive intelligence that can navigate to the greater, right? So if I, as a scientist, am learning all I am is matter and it can only do this, and right, versus over here, this like entering into confusion and sitting with it because of a sense, right? That we have that the organisms have that sense capacity that is somehow uh I don't know if it's beyond material, super material, whatever it is, but certainly the materialist story says that I don't have that kind of sensory intelligence, which I need if I want to be a scientist. And I do work on this every day myself, so thank you for bringing that in. Like listening to that, feeling that, so that I can wayfind through this vast possibility space into my next productive contribution, not in a monetary materialist economy way, but in terms of addressing these existential problems and liberating the greatness of humankind and science that's beyond where we are right now. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, thinking about um, again, getting back to kind of this, some of the challenges we have in your center that's focused on dialogue. Could you talk a little bit more of how you bring people together and what kind of dialogues are you encouraging there?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I have to say is that we often have to bring people together sort of non-publicly, because certainly there's sort of um, I don't know, it's just not okay for scientists to publicly talk about the sort of thing that we're talking about here. I mean, I guess it's getting a bit better, but I think the higher up the hierarchy in science you go, the less okay it is to come out and be talking about these things. Um, the the main way of bringing people together is finding people in different domains who are at a point of struggle that is of the same order as their point of fear of forward progress, right? And then through relating to those people and talking to them, finding those situations where this person's struggle, unbeknownst to them, is at a frontier, or maybe, in some intuitive sense, there, there's three people here struggling in that way, all at what might be a common frontier, right? And then, and not to, you can't tell them, right? I mean, I may be wrong when I'm often am wrong. Like the sense is really this would be a productive conversation, but to bring them together and to like hold and nurture and encourage the conversation and see if those what happens is those people do coalesce around this issue, and then what happens when they do, because they're bringing now that often people are stuck because it's one issue with just one perspective, and when you have the three perspectives, right, and the three people are joined, then the one issue, common issue, unbeknownst to them, that was at the center, can move forward. That's basically how the work comes around. And again, like we at the moment, for the moment, we came to this topic of consciousness as being the most productive there. Because spiritual people know that there's a thing up there about science. Scientists kind of, I mean, just stereotype, kind of tend to disregard the spiritual view, but also know that there's an issue for them in their own self. Kind of, if the third representative here is society, that's a situation where it may not be so clear that if I'm interested in the ecological crisis or societal crisis or economic crisis, that consciousness is a factor. But when that room opens up, then it does sort of start to become clearer, right? I think, yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question about, because kind of going back to the point you mentioned that things started changing for you, um, with a kind of loss of meaning that you had in high frequency trading and model development and some other areas. But it also started shifting for you because you started to have a family, and you
Yeah.
have then you project yourself into their futures, and what kind of future are you laying down for them? And so I wanted to ask you, kind of thinking forward, is that future that you're, I'll say, in your corner, that you would like to build, uh, that would make the planet not just better, but would foster meaning in on a new level across the sciences. Like I know your work in the center is very dialogue based, but it's probably a lot more than that. What is like the next 5 years look like?
So, I mean, the other thing that has sort of distilled out of the dialogical work is certainly the question of how do we open minds at scale, right? So I think in terms of the world, I mean, again, this can be totally projection from my own life, but I look out and I think in a way, like since maybe the 1600s, humankind, at least in the West, has gone down this narrow materialist path. So there's a huge sway. Even if people wouldn't describe themselves, everyday people wouldn't describe themselves, the person in the street as a materialist. Nevertheless, they're operationally, it's sort of everyday common sense. Yeah, materialism inheres in that in a way. So yeah, we can have conversations like this conversation and the dialogues at the center, and those are super important because little points of light, I'm going to say little on the scale of the planet, right? They open and they connect, and that's great. But then you go out and go, well, there's millions to billions of people caught in the same thing. What's to be done, right? And so when you ask what is it that I would like to give to my children, it's that opening and connection, right? Because in humankind in that state is going to be moving past and through these problems rather than sort of imploding into them. That's at least my take. In terms of the next 5 years, I mean, certainly to continue the relational and community building kinds of things, but there is also an experiment in consciousness science that I think can be paradigm shifting in terms of just changing our understanding of the kinds of information that the human is accessing and working with, and that can be a major contribution to that shift. I mean, because I think that like again, this crucible. of metacrisis, polycrisis is a call or an invitation or a summoning for us to step forward into our next level. And this is the biggest contribution, biggest feasible contribution that I have come up with in terms of something meaningful to do.
Yeah, and I think when you think about the uh, the paths forward that are positive here, you know,
Yeah.
I talk to a lot of people, and they're thinking of how what kind of organization would help them. Is it profit, nonprofit, some combination? Like, what is the new kind of organizational structures that um, that allow these opportunities to flower? And we still are in some old models in the way organizations are put together, and investment comes, and all of that. And so I think when you're talking, I'm thinking of what does that look like as setting a path and an example for a new kind of organization?
Well, that's super interesting. We haven't talked about this before, but you're, as usual, right at my cutting edge now, like what I was writing about yesterday. But so I think, the future of organization and the future of economy, because you're beautifully guiding this conversation through, sort of awakening or like aha moments and into purpose and meaning, right? And so the values tend to stem from the purpose that we are consciously or unconsciously aligned with, right? So when we're aligned with doing the best that we can in a materialist reality, then our values tend to be survival. But if we're looking beyond, then the value set changes. Now, does the flow of money? How does the flow of money change to reflect that new value set? How do we nurture and instill that quickly enough that the things that need to get funded? And in that, what are the economic and organizational models that are really going to support that? For example, you mentioned for profit, not for profit. I mean, maybe there's a middle way, but one thing I am clear on is that the future of the next great leap for humankind is not funded by donation, right? I mean, there needs to be something like more solid in terms of the sense of like urgency on the one hand, but also that what we're talking about is not, it's not like meditation is an airy fairy add-on at the end of my day, right? But there's something greater that's wanting to come forward in the human condition, and we can have a science of that, and science can be engaged in that. And this is like a real big thing that we should, it's the highest value, really, right? So how do we that's not even convinced. I mean, there's a part of me that's just kind of going, well, this must be emergent. So I just need to like sort of catalyze, nurture and catalyze my corner and then see the wave come out. But that's a really interesting question.
An interesting question because I mean, because it's near and dear to me, is that we are birthing um, not just products, and a lot of organizations in tech and beyond are very product oriented, and for good reasons.
Yeah,
Um, and so they can be service oriented too, but the point is that they're highly monetized, and they usually focus on, lock in, network effect,
right.
getting that huge number of eyeballs on whatever it is they're doing. So I think it's important when you talk about scale. I mean, I was kind of filtering in my head, the kind of scale that actually you see often larger tech companies do a really good job at
Mhm.
building, and yet we're talking about scale that has a very different impact. Like, how would we scale, for example, empathy? How would we
Right.
scale, vulnerability, or these ideas that are super core, not only to ourselves, but to kind of our pro-social existence going forward?
Well, I mean, I have some ideas. They're pretty out there, but
You
we
know,
could go
this
there
is
if you would
about being
like.
out
But
there. You're on the
huh?
Atomic Podcast, my friend.
Right, right. So, so the next great phase of human civilization, let's call it that, right, has to be beyond the monetized value measure. That's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about like getting beyond survival in a materially limited or scarce for many people world and into like a different way of living, right? So, but what I'm going to talk about now isn't, I'm not saying this is the end game. It might be a way to like help facilitate the leap, right? Okay. So one part of it, and I know there's part of me that sort of crumbles inwardly when I say this, but but it's like making empathy and vulnerability more objectively measurable, right? And what I mean by that is not questionnaires, but advances in understanding of the complete human system, and for example, new kinds of brain imaging, or even beyond that. I won't say too much about that, but right. So, I mean, we're going in that direction anyway, right? Sort of with digital medicine and computational psychiatry and so on. So can we have a good understanding of that, right? And that's one thing. We can see when it's there and it's not there in some objective way, right? And again, I know, but bear with me. Um, but then the shift in the worldview of the context in which that's happening, where we start to see these are the key resources, right? Right. If it's measurable and crucial, right, then can can the currently monetized funds and resources come to that? And so what I'm thinking about is, we spend a lot of money. So education is a topic that's dear to my heart. We spend a lot of money, sort of rote drilling, often useless knowledge sets, fact sets into our children in the education system. So can we introduce in there, the empathy, vulnerability kinds of things and show an ROI? Because again, I know measuring children with, but I don't, this is the idea, because we're stuck in this thing of that all we value is what we can measure, right? We need to get beyond that. So what's the change? The change is, if we're going to measure and value things, let's make them the things that you're talking about: empathy, vulnerability, and so on, right? Because again, like, and it's so true, things like there are various kinds of interpersonal work that are flowering again in small places that support the outbreak of empathy, vulnerability, and so forth, but it's still kind of being crushed by the materialist. And I would say that the materialism I have in mind is not just a scientific materialism. And you said something like, you had the sense that a lot of people are feeling the weight of materialism, uh, like economic materialism, right? And John Maynard Keynes said something like, people are really unaware of how much what they're navigating is the ideas of some old dead man, right? And so, I mean, I think that is the situation that we find ourselves in. So we've really got to look for scalable, measurable, valued solutions to the problems of making everything measurable and monetized. I mean, it's such a small needle to thread, but I love that you bring it up.
Yeah, because really, how we actually sort of push forward this, I'll say, emergence of these values that are crushed often or put aside. I don't think they're fully crushed, or we wouldn't have this discussion. Um, so, I think what's really important in our discussion right now, I think, is what are the approaches across dialogue creation, across community building, across mentoring and encouraging the new scientists in ourselves and in others, that we can put in place more uh, to to have that future that is, I'll say, more innovative, or certainly more innovative towards these values.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a
I
great
don't have an
question. I mean,
answer, but I'm just
no, I,
I'm
no,
kicking
I,
around with you.
yeah. I mean, so I mean, again, this is along the lines of just like, oh my God, aha, kind of moments. So one thing that I did along the way was when I started to run into more and more problems with engaging people in dialogue, particularly scientists. I trained as a psychotherapist actually, in order to just try and get more insight into what's going on in not so much a psychotherapist of pathology, but just of like normal human interacting and relating. And something that I found, um, the key to effective psychotherapy is the relationship. It's got nothing to do with what the therapist has learned as a method. I mean, if as long as they use that method to foster and nurture a relationship, right, it'll be effective. And then I also found that there's something about the materialist paradigm that stifles that kind of relationship. And the heart of that relationship is to at least explore, and it may not make any sense to a materialist mind, that there's a way in which you are an aspect of me and I am an aspect of you simultaneously, and we are both part of and in some sense synonymous with something larger, right? Now, that's paradoxical, but it causes a pop. If you can hold it and actually enter it, it causes a pop in the relational space. And I think it deepens. And I think people know the people in their lives, and the rare people usually who relate to them in that way, right? Rather than, oh, there's a collection of molecules over there, here's a collection of molecules over here. Let's try and make these pressure waves in the air to somehow transmit meaning between the two, right? So and I think this is the really toxic relationship between scientific materialism and human flourishing, is that it pushes, if you take in scientific materialism, it pushes out that way of relating so that it's one or the other, right? So to have exemplars, people, ambassadors, I mean, I definitely see you as one who can both be super proficient in the technical, right? Right. And at the same time relate from this other. That that, my friend, is the recipe for a wildfire. Like not just emergence, but Cambrian explosion, right? That's my hope anyway.
I have a great hope with you on the Cambrian explosion in this way. Um, I want to ask the opposite question of to both of us. So we're talking against materialism, and we're saying that it has a certain kind of limited aspect. It's very causal, very explanatory, and much of its epistemology. It's also done incredible things that have been beneficial.
Yes.
And
Thank
so
you.
it's like I'm assuming, and I'm just saying I'm assuming that we're not trying to in a way diss materialism. We're not trying to sort of put it aside. We're really trying to say there is more, different ways of thinking that if you stay in a materialist mindset, you will miss. So in other words, living in a world that's materialist is gonna be going on in a way forever. But living in other types of worlds and acknowledging they exist, that to me um, sounds very promising. And they should always be touching or overlapping, right? Um, I just, I often do talk to people about materialist approaches, both those that don't even know what I'm talking about, but those that have actually had the flip, so to speak. They've moved to the other side, like you. Um, the but it's often ends up being materialist bashing.
Yeah, no, so I mean, I do something even, thank you so much for bringing this in. I sometimes do something even more controversial, which is speak for the benefits of capitalism. I mean, it's a similar thing, right? I mean, okay, so we've outlived capitalism in a particular definition of that, and we can see the damage that it's done. But we can also see, oh my God, the uplift from crushing poverty, right? Materialism. I mean, I don't even usually use that word. I've cut some slack here because it's you, but precisely because there's this whole train, so I reframe the bits of it that I see as troubling, and then I give that another. I call it dynamically orthodox physics, right? Because of so many benefits. It's not that we want to get rid of materialism; we want to uh, open its boundaries a little bit without diluting its intellectual precision. We want to do some experiments to then expand those boundaries. So it's still science with experiment. And then that softened and expanded thing, like you say, we want it that can touch something else that's as real, or in some views, more real, right? And so that's what we want to do. We want to keep it, open it, extend it, connect it, and then it's going to be even more gifts. Of course, so many. I mean, look at where we've come from. Essentially, the Dark Ages. You could say materialism has been the train. It's just simply that that particular version of it is now up for revision for an even greater good. Let's put it that way. Thank you for bringing that up. It's a great point.
And when you do talk to scientists, or I should say, we'll say newly minted scientists, so those that have recently come out of school, do you find a kind of nihilism? Do you find a kind of hope? Do you find a kind of wonder? I mean, those are very different things. That's why I'm sort of putting them out there. How,
Yeah.
what's the state of affairs that you generally have a beat on and experience?
Well, I mean, there is generationally, in my experience, some despair and anger for sure about the state of the world. Um, whether that's better, more pronounced or less pronounced in scientists as compared to the population as a whole, I'm not sure that I could say. I think I I find a bifurcation actually between those two. Some people, some young scientists are just like, let's get on a track and make the best life that I can while the world burns down around me. Others are, well, maybe there's something that we can do. I mean, in some ways, I within the hopeful category, I find some misplaced hope, like the belief that science as it is can be the solution to the existential problems. And there, for people who I feel wanting it or ready for it, I just try and explore maybe some versions of science are part of the problem. I mean, I think the great example for this is climate change, right? So, so of course there are climate change deniers who are ignoring the science, right? But then when people say things like the science is in, I'm not doubting. I'm not trying to this will probably get me banned from YouTube, or maybe I shouldn't even say this. but but I mean, science is never in. Anthropogenic climate change is real, right? But it's like we need to expand science a bit, right, into connecting with this sort of other dimensions of reality that are going to be of help to us in moving forward. It's a bit of a mixed bag there. And then I do meet people who just shock me in a beautiful way. Like I have this story about me, right? That to get here, I had to go through all these things and decades of whatever, and they're already where I am now, right? Young people, like people in their 20s, I meet them, and then I'm just like, I'm full of hope. It's like, wow, it's not about me mentoring them or anything. Like somehow reality is producing them. It's great to connect.
Yeah, I've asked scientists that I've worked with that maybe are out of school a couple of years, and we worked together for a while, and I asked them this question. So, if you ever do your postdoc again, what would you do? And let's say they've had 5 years of industry work. They say, I wouldn't look at my formulas or what I'm creating. I would look at the impact. And many of them, not all of them, would go into climate related sciences or climate impact using climate sciences as a kind of overarching rubric for their work. Um, and you see that, I see that more and more. They're really looking at what it is that my scientific insights and my technical skills can actually do in the world.
Right.
Not for the company
Yeah.
and not for just my career, but in the world. I do see that, and maybe that's partly what you're saying, um, is that they're coming out of school looking in that kind of way to having impact. That's super
Mm.
encouraging, by the way.
That is super encouraging. And there's a yes and to that, which comes back to I think one of the things that you speak passionately and beautifully about, which is again like the humanities, right? And what is the contribution? Okay, so I'm not again, it's like we need both kinds of people, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with anything in my world, really. I mean, there are some limits, but in terms of the things we're talking about. But okay, so wanting to make a technical contribution in climate mitigation or whatever is a beautiful and necessary thing, right? Right. Now over here, here's the person who's also had that humanistic education, who may also be sort of looking into the humans, the whole dimension of not just humans, but being. that is creating the climate change and meeting that too, right? So, we do need a spectrum of people again that somehow there are these wonderful people who are surviving academic training and coming out with both expertise and a humanistic, a deep looking. But I think one of the things that I would love to see happen is if academic training could also follow that. Maybe that's a pipe dream.
I
But
do see, I'm a super fan of the academy in certain ways. I don't want it to ever necessarily go away, but we tend to beat up on the things sometimes we love. And in this case, the remarkable progress in research and development that you see in some of our institutions, academic institutions, is over the last 100 years is not to be sneezed at. Um, and so the idea that training comes out of there of young scientists that is less than optimal, because of the scope of experience and perspective they have, just is just not acceptable. It's not that the academy is not acceptable. It's that there's just some changes that need to be made. And in fact, go back to the late 19th century,
right,
in terms of how the arts and humanities were configured, which were the arts and humanities. you know, and which actually gave birth to a lot of innovations that you saw in the 20s, the teens and 20s and 30s. It wasn't, I mean, it wasn't that I'm just saying from a physicist standpoint, that the physics were not in silos. I mean,
right.
they were coming because they were cross-pollinated by a lot of other types of understandings of systems and understandings of the way they thought the world could be imagined, and also the methodology to imagine. And I think these ideas come also out of literature. They come out of the arts. They come out of the richness of that. That as a scientist, I am really at the peak in terms of creativity. The world looks to the way I imagine it. Now, that might be a lot of narcissism, but the idea is that that kind of confidence of imagination and discovery was very palpable around that sort of 20, 30, 40 years. And um, and I that is really what I try to encourage in people, even in our discussion, is looking at the edges and what is
Yeah,
there
yeah.
and what can we bring in and then serve up as a future that is more promising.
Well, certainly there was this thing in physics that I bang on about sometimes that between 1890 and 1930, I always have this sense of this sort of wondrous wonder, and that um, psychology, maybe in physics, there were more dialogues going on there. And as you say, arts, humanities, science was just a sort of let's, as humankind, explore. I'm not to idealize those times at all, obviously, with the wars and so forth, but and the Great Depression and all of that. But then, let's take quantum theory, massive developments and revolutionary, like narrative worldview changing about the basis of reality. And then in 1955 and after, when quantum field theory, this incredible mathematical machinery was developed, then fundamental physics, at least particle physics, just became about can you use this machinery to produce new results, right? That's what it became. And while that's what I studied at grad school, while there's extraordinary wonder for a mathematician in going out of all the universes of universes of universes of mathematics, here's this little kind of corner that seems to have this 27 significant figure correspondence with the basis, in one sense, of our reality, right? That's wonderful. But then after that, all you get to do is really, I mean, nothing new has happened in particle physics since 1967. When the Higgs theory was developed and when I was born, right? I feel responsible. I haven't done anything with my life in physics. Um, that like the wonder has gone out, and the Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg said that the more we understand something like, the more we understand the universe, the more meaningless it becomes from a particle physics point of view. But if we go back to a world where um, the humanities, the arts, and the sciences weren't split in this way, then meaning was still a question that was up for inquiry, and somehow, we've left that behind, and that is perhaps the biggest curse, really, of materialism, the sense of, well, science is the way to understand where we are. Arts and humanities are sort of fantasies, right? That can entertain us in our modern materialist nightmare, but this is really how it is: meaningless, mechanical, or probabilistic. And I think that, this split and the world that results from that is exactly the existential crisis that we have. And so it's almost like the problem has caused this, which is calling us to reconverge there. And I think that comes from science really looking at some of its problem points and edges and trying to let in something new.
I'm going to close with a question that I've never asked anyone, but I want to ask you. Um, if you were to write a letter to your young self as a scientist, what what would it sound like? What would that be?
Wow.
Kind of encouragements. You don't have to write the letter, but I'm just wondering,
Sure.
what would it look like? What would you want to say?
Take your feeling space way more seriously. Um, Go in however you can. You have to go inward, into self, somehow in balance with the way in which you are sort of developing this massive understanding of the outer. I mean, these words are tricky because I say inner and outer. I don't mean inner and outer of the skin surface. I mean in being. And so even to encourage I would say you will recoil or be confused at this inner outer, because I'm not talking about sitting with your kidneys, right? There is a dimension of being in there that is beyond that. Give as much to finding and making contact with that as you do to string theory and computational neuroscience and modern portfolio theory, right? Um, and I mean, I'm feeling it now, like I'm feeling a sadness. Yeah, wow, about just sort of over all the time, in a sense, a waste, right? Those hours that could have been repurposed from accumulation of knowledge to sort of connection with self. But it was bound to happen, I suppose, given where I was. But that's a beautiful question. I think that one will go with me through the days and weeks to come, because it's very healing, because I think there's a part of me left behind in the past, that was subjugated, an inner that was subjugated and neglected in the search of all of this outer. And maybe that is sort of a mirror of what's happened to humankind, right? And I'm still living that. So to become, I mean, I think this is really important. And it's it's beautifully latent in some of your redirections of, like, we're not bashing materialism, we're not bashing the academy, right? It's that whenever I'm saying something about out there, I'm always working it in here too. So I too, over reduce, I limit, I'm still in blinders, all of that. I'm not at all, we're not at all, well, I'm trying not to anyway, hold myself up as a paragon at all, but just to go, well, I made some progress there. That's a revelation. Let me share that direction of travel that I've discovered in myself that's valuable. I'm still traveling. So I'm going to keep, for the rest of the day, I'm going to dedicate it to connecting with that younger self and finding those pieces. Thank you so much. It's beautiful.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you for a remarkable discussion, and keep traveling.
You too, my friend. It's really a joy to meet you, and I look forward to future conversations.
Absolutely. Take good care.